Hola, benvingudes. Comencem aquest acte que ens fa especial il·lusió, és bastant xulo. El Canòdrom és aquest espai municipal que no sé si coneixíeu o heu vingut abans en els seus usos. És un espai municipal que des dels últims mesos ha agafat un nou caire. Ara mateix aquest espai s'ha obert una altra vegada sota el paraigües de l'Ateneu d'Innovació Digital i Democràtica. Nosaltres, aquí des de Canòdrom, el que fem és volem apropar ciutadania i el debat en general, mirades crítiques sobre la tecnologia, mirant també com la democràcia i la participació interseccionen amb la tecnologia en aquests espais més híbrids de participació ciutadana. Juntament amb l'Espai Societat Oberta i amb Algorights organitzem aquest acte d'avui, que és la presentació del llibre i conversa amb la seva autora, el llibre de l'automatització de la desigualtat. Dono la veu a Jordi Vaquer, director de l'Oficina Barcelona de l'Open Society Foundation.
Thank you. It is indeed a pleasure and a very exciting conversation that we have ahead today. I am Jordi Vaquer, as you just heard. I am the director of the Open Society Foundation's office here in Barcelona. Just 2 words about it. We are the world's largest philanthropic organization devoted to rights and liberties issues, human rights and liberties. We have been present in the city in Barcelona since 2013. And in this city, we have a particular identity, as it's called Espai Societat Oberta. And what we do in Espai Societat Oberta is we try to make connections. We try to connect the different worlds of activism, social justice activism, that we engage with here and elsewhere in the world. We try to connect inside the city and in particular with our global network of partners and grantees. So this SPI, this hub of civil society, has been increasingly working at the intersection of technology and human rights. And the organizations that are our partners in organizing today's event inhabit exactly the same intersection, and that's why we came together and we brought Virginia Eubanks, who you came to see. Not me. Virginia is a writer, is a teacher, is a welfare rights activist, is a thinker, a researcher, an organizer, many things at the same time. She's also an academic who teaches at the Department of Political Science at State University of New York in Albany. She's from Troy, New York, USA, and that may have something to do with what we're going to be talking about today, or not, she'll tell us. And she focuses on social justice and technology. Has been writing for a number of American magazines, for the American Prospect, The Nation, Harper's. She's currently guest editing at the Guardian US a series called Artificial Care, which is a series of articles documenting the impacts of the growing application of artificial intelligence technologies to the field of care, healthcare, old people care, all sorts of areas. And for full disclosure, my organization is supporting that series, the Open Society Foundations, so you all know. She's co-edited with a dear colleague from the Open Society Foundations, Alethea Jones, a volume about it's called Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith. In 2011, the MIT Press published a book by her called Digital Dead End, Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age. 2011 is where we were all mesmerized about, Twitter and the Tunisian Revolution and Indignados and Occupy. And I imagine Virginia also was mesmerized, but at the same time, she was looking from a different angle to how some particular products of information technology may have very liberating and very good impacts, but could also serve as tools of oppression for poor and working class women and families. And she came back to the perspective of poor and working class people on the uses of technology 7 years later with a new book called Automating Inequality: How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. which Gemma Deza translated and Captain Swing published in Spanish under the title La automatización de la desigualdad, which you can find at the back end today, and which is what brings her here. We're going to talk mostly about the book, but also about the perspectives that lie behind some of the work also in your series, the other series you are co-editing. Let me start by saying that time and again we've heard this narrative that problems such as growing inequality, the devastation of the working class, especially the manufacturing working class, and their life prospects, all these things would have a solution in more broadband access, more application of technology to policymaking, high-tech jobs, these kind of things, right? And already a decade ago, you were saying, this is magical thinking, right? Just to expect technology to solve these issues, those are social issues, those are not technological challenges. And I think my first question is, how did you become interested in that intersection, in the intersection between social exclusion and technology? What brought you to this topic?
Buenas tardes. Lamento mucho no hablar español. Perdón, lo siento. Gracias por su paciencia y atención. While I struggle with that is the extent of my Spanish. So thank you so much for being here, for your attention, for your patience with me as I learn what's happening in Spain and share whatever insight I have in my reporting and work over. Jordi so kindly made you aware how old I am, over my work since the early 1990s around these topics. And I'm so grateful that you asked this question about how I came to the work, because it is a story I get to tell about my own ignorance and how I was incredibly lucky to be in a community of people who kindly and gently brought me, made me aware of the limitations of my understanding at the time. So as a young person, I was living in the Bay Area of California in the 1990s. I was deeply involved in a social movement at the time that was known as the community computing movement, or the community computer center movement. The understanding, the sort of frame that that movement had was that the central problem of the information age for poor and working class communities was the problem of access, what we call the digital divide. And I was very invested in this as a framework. I had a lot of technical skills. I cared very much about my neighbors in my community, and I thought this was something that I could contribute. And that was true in part. But when I moved to Troy, which is now my hometown, in 1997, I started working in a community of women who lived basically in a single-room occupancy hotel, about 90 women who lived in that community. And after, I'd say, almost a year of working in that community to build technological capacity, to offer technological training, and to provide venues where we did participatory design of technology and events and space, the women of the community basically sat me down and said, Virginia, we think you're very sweet, but all of your questions are stupid and have nothing to do with our lives. And I was very lucky in that moment that I was in a community that supported me enough to help me think better about what the issues actually were. And so I asked, I was like, okay, if we're getting it wrong, how do we do better? And they said, the problem is not that we lack access to technology per se. The problem is that technology has too much access to us. So they described stories about encountering high-tech punitive tools in their communities in public housing, in law enforcement, in the low-wage workforce. So, for example, about a third of them already worked in high-tech labor, but it was low-paid contingent high-tech labor, data centers, data entry centers, call centers, that kind of work. And then they said the thing that pretty much changed the trajectory of the rest of my work from that moment on, which was, and also in the welfare office. So they told me stories about going to public assistance at some of the most difficult moments in their lives, and facing the back end of a computer and a caseworker who sort of hid behind the screen and said, "You're not in the system." And that was really the sort of origin point of much of the work that has come since then.
And then 7 years after Digital Dead End, you came back to the issue with the book we're talking about today. And what had happened in the meantime when you write Automatic Inequality? What's new? What kind of caught your attention and said, I need to write this other book?
Yeah. So there's a very persistent story about poverty in the United States, which I think is a bit different than the story that gets told here. And that story is that poverty affects a very tiny percentage of the population, and that tiny percentage of the population is probably pathological. That poverty is a result of bad individual choices. And so the first thing these digital systems should do is do a kind of moral diagnosis, meaning they should decide whether or not you are desperate enough and moral enough to deserve basic human rights like healthcare, housing, or food. So one of the issues I was facing in that time was that against such a powerful story, my work as an academic of gathering facts and also stories was not proving very effective, because people would be like, nope, that's not true. And I'd be like, no, but really, this is the data. And they'd be like, no, it's just that people don't want to work. Or it's just that people make bad choices, or they shouldn't have had that kid, right? And so what struck me is not so much that the technology had changed in that time, but that my intervention point had changed. And so I became really interested in telling stories of people who were directly affected by these tools. Because I think when we talk about technology, we often abstract problems, and we often project them into the future. So the questions we tend to raise are like, will artificial intelligence steal all of our jobs 15 years from now? When if you ask families like the Stipes family or Angel and Patrick or Gary Boatwright or other people who I did reporting with in the book, they can tell you what's wrong with these systems right now, and that it's affecting their lives in this moment in really profound and life-altering ways. And so the book was really not so much about how the technologies had changed and more about how my thoughts about how to address the challenges that I continued to see, how my way of intervening had changed.
And could you tell us maybe one or two of those stories,
Yeah,
so to entice people to read the book? Maybe they're in the book, maybe they're not in the book, but how does it feel on the receiving end when these mechanisms of automation start being so crucial to your life?
Yeah. So I tell 3 stories in the book, and I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I'll give you an overview, and then if people want to ask more questions, I can talk about them all day long, because these family stories are extraordinary, and I owe a great debt. We all owe a great debt to them for their courage and their generosity, sharing their stories when they are in incredibly vulnerable positions in terms of receiving basic aid from the state. So I tell 3 stories in the book. One is a story of an attempt to automate all of the eligibility processes for the state of Indiana's public assistance benefits program. So that, again, hard for a Spanish audience, are things like healthcare, which everybody doesn't have access to in the United States, but there's a public program that helps poor and working families access healthcare, food, and cash benefits. And this, the governor signed what was eventually a $1.34 billion contract with IBM and a number of other tech companies to replace the work of frontline local caseworkers with online applications and these privatized call centers. And it resulted in 1 million denials of public assistance in the first 3 years of the experiment, more than a 54% increase from the years that preceded the experiment. And this was the source of great suffering for families like the Stipes family, who I talk about in the book. So Sophie Stipes was a young, well, at the time, a child with cerebral palsy who received a letter from the state telling her that she would lose her health insurance because she had failed to cooperate in establishing eligibility for the program, which actually meant that someone somewhere in the process had just made a mistake. But the letter that her family got didn't say what the mistake was or how to fix it. And because this system had cut the relationship between clients and caseworkers, they had no place to go for support. So this system really denied a lot of people basic needs that they were entitled to by law, and then forced them to figure out what had gone wrong in this really complicated system. So that's one of the stories I tell.
Thank you. And one of the angles of this debate in America and in Spain is the idea of bias, right? That because many of these algorithms learn from biased decision, then bias is going to not only to creep in, but then to become permanent, automatic, and some way legitimized, because it's the machine who said it. The machine has no preference of race or gender or something else. But your work goes deeper in many ways and includes a broader analysis of what you call the digital poorhouse, for example, right? You in some ways take not just the decisions, but the way in which a tradition of hiding, of surveilling, of disciplining, of excluding poor people is revived by technology. Can you say a bit more about how this happened?
Yeah, so there are two questions here, and they're both very good. So I'll try to be short and clear. The first is a question about the problems with bias as a frame. So the best way to explain this is by talking about the third tool I talk about in the book, which is called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. It is a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect sometime in the future in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is the county where Pittsburgh is. And what's so interesting is the logics that government agencies tend to use to explain why they want to use automated systems. The first logic is always efficiency and saving money. But the second logic, increasingly, is that the technology is less biased than human decision makers. And therefore, this is actually a move for greater equity. And I do think, to a degree, the critique of technology in these systems has been sort of captured by this frame of bias. And here's the problem with that. The problem is that in Allegheny County, the tool that they've implemented helps a particular set of frontline workers make decisions about which families will be screened in for full investigation and potentially for losing their children to foster care. And this is the child protection system in the United States is deeply racially biased and has been since its inception. So there is a great deal of racial disproportionality in what children are removed, what families are investigated, and what children are removed from their homes. Both Native American and African American families are wildly overrepresented. So it's not that bias is not an issue for the system, it absolutely is. But the issue is that bias doesn't actually enter the system where they are looking. So they are looking to these frontline caseworkers, and the county's own data shows that bias is not increased at that point, and in fact might be slightly corrected for at that point, because this line of workers is actually the most female, the most working class, and the most racially diverse of the entire workforce, right? So they're aiming a bias tool at one of the least powerful and most racially and economically diverse part of their workforces, and saying, okay, there, bias solved, problem solved. The reality is the great majority of bias that is coming into the system comes in at the point where the community reports a family to Child Protective Services. And this is nothing that a computer system can do anything about. And in fact, by automating or partially automating the process of screening by people who know a lot about the community and about the families in the community, it actually may serve to worsen bias and inequality in that system, or at least remove one of the filters that was keeping it out of the system. So it could, in the end, make that much worse. And the short version of this answer is that inequality is structural, not interpersonal, but these systems only see inequality as being the result of implicit or explicit bias by individuals, and it doesn't address these structural issues.
Thank you. We're going to open up the conversation gradually. Last question before we bring some people on stage. So exposing malfunction and abuse and the systematic nature of the problem is, of course, a crucial step. And it's crucial because this is a particularly obscure and unaccountable field. But exposure may not be enough, right, for policy change. So my question here is, what else is to be done? You've done the book, you've done that job you've done, but what else needs to be done? What tools, what tactics are already being deployed? Because you're also an activist, you're also in touch with activists. And what else could be done? I don't know, strategic litigation, community organizing. What is the remedy or the path to a remedy?
What is the solution? Is this what you're asking me?
Or at least
fix it? Oh, good. Yeah.
What is the
we'll
next?
Just fix it tonight.
Let me put it.
Yeah.
What's the next step after exposing and documenting
I'm just
what you've
making
done?
fun. So I think so. I can speak for myself here, and then I can tell you a bit what I see. So I'm a storyteller, and I'm really, really interested in speaking back to communities that are affected by these tools and sharing stories so that they can see their experience reflected in other people and understand that it's not just them. That really is my primary goal, and if I've done that, I feel like I've done my part. That said, storytelling, and particularly storytelling about individuals, is limited. It has limitations. And there are lots of other ways to address the kinds of issues that I raise in the book. So I think regulation and policy making is, of course, absolutely crucial. I hope and expect that we might do a better job in the United States, and I don't know how it is here, but I suspect you struggle with some of the same things, involving people who are directly affected by these tools in the process of deciding what the regulation of these tools should look like. So I think that needs to be a deeply participatory process. I think litigation makes a lot of sense. There's been some great and really interesting litigation happening in Arkansas around the algorithms that control benefits in the disability system, for example, in the United States, that I've been really excited to see some of that litigation start to bear fruit. I think that there is a role to play for expanding access to the tools, meaning, diversifying the tech workforce, changing the way computer science is taught and data science is taught. But my personal theory of change is that power concedes nothing without a demand. And so I really do think a lot of the solutions are going to come from people who are directly affected, are going to come from social movements of people coming together around shared problems. And that's certainly what happened in Indiana. So in Indiana, to end on a happy note, in Indiana, in the face of all of the suffering that families were experiencing, there just was this incredible momentum behind just old-fashioned shoe leather organizing. So photocopying flyers and stuffing them in bags at the corner store, getting people to come out to forums where they could speak to each other and also to their representatives and politicians. And they did succeed in stopping the system 3 years into a 10-year experiment. It wasn't a complete success. There were lots of things left undone. But I think it's a really hopeful story in many ways of how people can come together and make decisions of like, no, this is not going to work for our communities, not in this way, not at this time. That it's always possible to say no to these systems, and that's about building people's power.
Thank you. Why don't we enlarge this conversation?
Sí.
And I'll invite two representatives of two of the partner organizations in organizing this. So if Lina and Oyidiya, you can come up to stage with us. So to my immediate right is Oyidiya Oji Palino. She's a data scientist. She's an anti-racist and anti-colonial activist, and she's a member of Catàrsia, and she will explain you a bit more about this herself. And at the far end, we have Lina María González, who's a sociologist and a historian, and focuses on several things, including, for example, the impact of transnational corporations on human rights. But she's here also representing Algorights, one of the co-organizing institutions. And why don't you start, Lina, telling us about Algorights, and maybe if you have some questions for Virginia.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for let us to be here. And as Jordi has said, I'm representing Novact. It's a Catalan NGO, but we also are in Algorights network. And I will tell you more or less what is Algorights. We define ourselves as a collaborative network to promote the participation of people and civil society organizations in the field of artificial intelligence technologies from human right-based approach. The thing about Algorights is that we are a very multidisciplinary network. In fact, some of us are more related with technology development. Some of us are coming from NGOs and different kind of perspective. Some of us come from, for example, from different kind of intersectional social movements, and I think that is the richness of the group. In fact, as we are very different perspective, but the main goal is try to promote the human rights inside the artificial intelligence, the technology development. So yes, we define ourselves as a plural state, as a plural space, and we would like to promote in our local space, Barcelona, Catalonia, and we hope so the Spanish state also, a debate a debate that is very close to your proposals, in fact, in so many ways. Can I? Okay. We in Algorights have a lot of debates, a lot of readings. I have to say that your book, Impact, was a part of a public study group. I haven't been there at that moment, sorry. But several of us, we have been in different kind of study groups, which implied your book. I would like to, and I'm going to start from the end of your answer to Jordi. In fact, it's just a coincidence. It has not been prepared.
Vale.
The thing is, I have identified that in the core of your proposals is this idea of what you just said, the building people's power, the idea of the network of the social union, if you can say that, the global civil society union, and probably correct me if I'm wrong, but probably maybe to help an algorithmic social justice, of course the respect of human rights, the correction of this bias that you have been talking about, that actually, in fact, is increasing the discrimination because at the end, the technology is not objective and is not neutral. So, I'm going to start from you to what you say. How have you imagined this kind of global network? Because you are talking about several issues that are happening in the United States, but some of those issues are common here, also in Spain. And you also say in the case of Allegheny situation, that the software was built in New Zealand, but in New Zealand they didn't apply it, and they finally found Allegheny the place to do it. So how the global community, from Togo to Thailand to where I'm from, Colombia, from wherever we are, how can we create the global network, and how can we protect each other in these cases?
I so appreciate that question, because this is exactly the question I asked myself when I finished this book, which is, I've been very, very lucky that the book has found a lot of readers, and that has meant that I have been just so grateful to come to many other places like Spain and Finland and other places, Australia, New Zealand, and other places around the world. I've sought connection with activists and organizers there to say, like, hey, what's happening here? Hey, what's happening here? One of the things I've been really excited about in the last few years has been the growing conversation about algorithmic injustice. But I feel like there are still two things that are often really missing in that conversation. One is the voices of people who are most impacted, right? So voices of families like the Stipes family and Angel and Patrick and Gary Boatwright. The other is a more global conversation, because the state actors, they're talking to each other across national lines. The companies and the contractors, the private organizations, are certainly talking to each other across national lines. And I'm not sure as people who are concerned and interested in the relationship between these technologies and social justice, I'm not sure we're doing as good a job as we could in talking to each other. The answer for me has been that I've started a new project with my dear friend and colleague Andrea Quijada from New Mexico in the United States, collecting oral histories in 12 countries around the world from people who are directly impacted by these tools. This is a very small intervention and not an answer to your question. It is an answer to what I can do about what my piece of that work feels like it is. So we're working in 12 countries, in the US and the UK and Finland and Spain, Uganda and Kenya, Colombia and Mexico, Indonesia, the Philippines, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is, of course, an impossible and insane project. But so far, we've been able to develop these sort of rich narratives of people's lives that when you put them in conversation with each other, do start to show some patterns in how people experience these tools around the world. This is not to say that like the context doesn't matter, that the politics on the ground don't matter, that how people respond doesn't matter. Of course it does. Like, we're not trying to sort of generalize from these stories, but we do think one step is putting people's stories in conversation with each other so we can all start to see where our common shared concerns are, and perhaps we can work on building coalition and organizing from an understanding of people's actual experience on the ground. I'm one player in this. This is, of course, work that needs to be done by many, many people, but I'm excited about that part of the work. Yeah.
Good. Oyidiya, you want to introduce a little bit Catàrsia and then maybe ask some words?
Yeah, this one is working then. So yeah, I'm representing Catàrsia, which is a collective or an association from Barcelona. We are an Asian descendant group. Most of us, we are born here, but some others are from different places of the diaspora. And we gathered together because we just explaining, as you said, explaining different stories from many different backgrounds. We saw that there were some patterns that they were actually, connecting each other. So that's why we thought that it was a good idea to build this association, as it was a completely different one from the typical what we have here, which are more related to traditional, cultural from different countries, but never trying to connect different countries or people who are already been raised here, which is something completely different. So we try to work through activism. For us, it's super important to teach people, especially people, young people and teenagers, especially through arts, through other kind of languages that they can understand, other kind of narratives, I would say, because I guess now with the media, it's super easy to have access to some kind of to stories, but sometimes it depends on how they are weaved. And yeah, so from there, from arts, we try to build workshops or even festivals in order to approach other kind of narratives. And yeah, we are a feminist group or collective, anti-racist and apolitical. And yeah, so we try always to approach also to schools and to just to make them feel, or at least to make them a click inside their minds that there's something happening and that they should be at least alert with what is happening around them, right? Because sometimes it's just like you have the feeling that there's something happening, but you don't know why, and you don't have any other person to talk about this because you think that it's only on your mind. And yeah, and my question would be, because it seems from what you are explaining from yesterday and today, that there is no way that the policies we have in our countries can be automated. But do you think there is a way, or at least there's one policy, even if it's a tiny one, that could be, that could be automated in a way that biases are not arising, or that they are not being extended by any way, or extended, for example?
This is a fabulous question, Gracia. Thank you so much. So I think that one of the great fears I have about these technologies as policy-making tools is that they are often talked about as if they're objective and neutral and only administrative, like they aren't actually making political decisions. And so I think the answer to your question is quite counterintuitive, because I believe that some of the answer here is not in trying to produce neutral or objective technology or policy, but is in trying to produce policy and technology that embraces a wider range of core values. So currently, when we develop technology to implement policy, the values we build into it are efficiency, cost savings, sometimes fairness in a very technical sense. These are important values for governance, but they're not the only values for trying to make decisions in human community. So self-determination should be one of these values. Autonomy should be one of these values. Equity, abundance instead of precarity. All of these should be values that we build into these systems. So I often use the metaphor of building, apologies to people who came to see me last night, you've heard this already, but it's a good metaphor, if building these tools to be neutral is like building a car with no transmission in order to try to navigate a world that is very hilly and very turny, and which is the map, the terrain of inequality that we live in today, is full of very steep hills and very sharp turns. And so if you build something that's supposed to navigate that world without any gears, then you should not then be surprised when you careen down the hill and burst into flames at the bottom. So we have to be building equity gears into these technologies. And so the examples that I've seen that do feel like good examples of using automation to support social justice, they've tended to be from social movement spaces, maybe, rather than the state, though it's not impossible for the state to do it if we put pressure on them. And they've tended to be movement grounded organizations that have that are very clear about what their values are. So one is an organization in Chicago called M Relief. And M Relief comes out of and is very much embedded in the ethic of the welfare rights movement in the United States. So one of the things that is very important to them is protecting people's dignity and the basic premise that everyone should get every benefit to which they're entitled. And this is just not, these are not the values that are built into to other technologies. And they end up working very differently. They end up interacting with people very differently, and they have ended up being able to correct some of the ways that policy is actually implemented in states like California, because they've called to their attention that they're, for example, collecting data they don't need to collect for implementing the policy. For example, your legal status. So I absolutely think it's possible. I think where we start is from an acknowledgement that politics is a very inefficient, a very human way to try to negotiate sometimes irreconcilable needs, desires, objectives, interests, and that is something that is very difficult to do with computers. It's that politics isn't just moving data, right? It's also about negotiating human difference.
Virginia, can I push you a little bit more on one of the values, autonomy? Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit more about how this autonomy needs to be reflected, what it means in concrete for the people who are affected by it.
So I can give an example of why I think it's so important, and it'll be interesting to then speak a little bit about what I've learned in the Spanish context. I have been here 8 days. I do not pretend to be an expert in any of this, but there are patterns. So in the United States, because we're so invested in this story that poverty only happens to people who might deserve it, ideas about universal economic rights are very rare. And what that means is our programs are quite punitive and quite surveillance. We look quite deeply into people's lives. There's an organization in Jackson, Mississippi called Magnolia Mothers Trust. And Magnolia Mothers Trust right now is experimenting with a universal basic income. And what I like about them is that their sort of grounding ethic, their grounding question is, what if we asked poor African American moms what they needed, and then when they told us what they needed, we believed them? And when they asked, they said, what we need is cash. And so they're like, okay, we believe you, here's cash. And they're now sort of following what happens. Now, what's interesting about the context here in Spain that I am just learning about right now is the ingreso mínimo vital. So perhaps my hopes for the healing of something like a universal basic income are a bit naive, because it doesn't seem that the ingreso mínimo vital worked perfectly, just to, coming out the gate, right? So there are more layers than just that. But that's what I mean when I say autonomy. What I mean when I say autonomy is asking people what they need and then believing them when they tell you.
Thank you. Wonderfully put. I'm going to still give Lina and Oyidiya an opportunity, but I'm going to already ask the audience to start thinking if you have questions, because after that, we'll open up the conversation. So, Lina, do you want to ask a bit more? Or rebate or disagree?
I had one, but after hearing you, I have many. So I will try to keep myself. You have been talking about, in your book, you have been talking about this oath of non-aggression, about just like for the developers, for the company developers, about the data. But now you said recently in an interview in a Spanish paper that now, 3 years later, you think that's just a piece of the puzzle. So you are thinking about more pieces of that puzzle. Maybe the idea of the gathering of a big network, or even this study, this research of 12 different countries, is another piece of the puzzle, as I am understanding. Do you have you imagined another pieces? But this take me into a parallel question with this. That is, this oath of non-aggression has an ethical idea behind. Should we move maybe should we altogether advocacy the global network for some kind of mandatory global regulation, maybe, instead of the ethical approach? Maybe if you have this capacity or this possibility to identify patterns in this 12-country research, maybe we should try to move into some global mandatory regulation.
So the brief answer to your first question, I do just want to mention that I think the Hippocratic oath that I provide for designers at the end of the book is still, it's still pretty good. I wouldn't mind if engineers took that oath. I'd be okay with that, and then did it. What I came to understand about my own work was that I was thinking of the book as having 3 primary audiences: policymakers, designers of the tools, and people affected by the tools. And after 3 years of talking about the book, I decided I don't care as much about designers or policymakers, and I really care about the people who are affected by the tools. And so that solution doesn't really address them. And so that's what I've stepped back from. So when it is not among my talking points anymore. It's not something I usually talk about because I think it is only a small piece of the puzzle. But I think what you're raising is so important, particularly at this moment, because we're in a moment, at least in the United States, I'd be curious to hear what's happening here when we get to Q&A. But we're in this moment in the United States where there has been quite a lot of attention to algorithmic inequity or algorithmic justice that has come mostly from social movements pushing back against harmful tools. And just at that moment, particularly during the pandemic, when things felt like there was enough pressure that we could start to see some political results from it, all of a sudden the conversation starts to shift to this thing called AI ethics. And I love ethical behavior, like I'm a big fan, but I think asking designers and even policymakers to self-regulate is probably a bad idea. I don't think that, as if we look at history, traditionally worked very well. You know, it's like, so this is maybe a little unfair, but I often say, you know, I've met so many really well-intentioned data scientists, so many really smart computer scientists and engineers who care deeply about the same issues that I care about. But the industry as a whole, it's a bit like finance in the 80s. And in the 80s, we maybe wouldn't have said, here's the solution to the economic crisis we're about to enter. Let's do ethical training for investment bankers. I'm not sure that's the best solution, right? So it does feel to me like regulation is, of course, a big part of the answer. Then the details of that's quite hard, particularly when you're talking across national boundaries. And that's going to take a lot of political work. So I absolutely think that that's one of the major places that we have to focus attention. But I don't pretend to know, like, oh yeah, no, I have that regulation. I have it written right here. I don't pretend to know what that should be. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. Oyidiya, you have some more questions?
Yeah, my question would be related to violence because, or death in this case, because there's a part in your book where you are talking about it. Because one of the visions or ideas that we have is that there's violence if we see it, if there's a verbal, I don't know how to say it, but yeah, a verbal or physical demonstration about it. But there's also violence that comes from the public administration towards people who are really in need of those, or desperate in many cases, of social services or trainings or many other activities that the public administration knows that they are in that power in order to give them these solutions. So my question would be, how can we convince the public administration that automating this kind of policies or help is not beneficial for those who are more in need of those services, of that aid, and how can we tell them or make them understand that they are amplifying the suffering of those people by thinking that a machine can give them a score solution, an instant solution that will be equitable probably for all the people, for all the population, when it's not true, when they really know that without machines, they have not been able to do that.
This is a crucial question. Thank you. So, and it touches on my own experience in a way that I want to share very briefly. So as I was sitting down to write the first manuscript of this book in October of 2016, I'd gone to my very first writer's retreat, and I was sitting in like a millionaire's mansion in the woods writing about the poorhouse. When my partner, my beloved partner, Jason, was attacked and beaten really brutally about a block and a half away from our house. And since then, I've been thinking a lot about trauma. And naming trauma in that specific way. So he has since developed a pretty severe and chronic case of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so this is something that we think about a lot, violence. We think a lot about violence. And one of my new projects, which is a really important to me, is some more personal writing about our experience getting through this period of time together, getting through this experience together. And when I described that work to the people who published my books, they were like, I don't get it. Like, this is totally different from everything you've done before. Can't you just write another book about technology? I broke up with that publisher, by the way. To my disappointment. I'm now a free agent, if anyone cares. But I was telling the story to a dear friend of mine named Jack, and Jack looked at me with shock, and he said, but this is exactly what you've always written about. Like, you've always written about trauma. All your work is about trauma. And I think it's so important to be very direct that economic violence is violence. Period. It kills people, it disintegrates families, it wastes an extraordinary amount of human potential that could be released if we weren't committed to a system that is predicated on exploitation and violence. So I think that's absolutely crucial to note. The response to how do we respond with public administration, another small story, not me this time, but a hopeful story, less depressing. So the story is, when I was looking at the history of where what I call in the book the digital poorhouse emerged and how, I live in New York State, and I was near the capital of the state, and so I'm very close to the New York State archives. So I started looking back through the archives about when this system actually emerged. Originally, I thought it was maybe in the 1990s when there was a really big policy change. I looked in the archives. Nope, the system was already there. Okay, so I'm going to go back. I'm looking in the 1980s. This is when the technology became available. Nope, system was already there. And so I kept going back. And what I found was that the tools in public welfare in New York State were made digital at exactly the moment that the national welfare rights movement had begun to successfully bring caseworkers on board with their agenda. So what happened in 1969 was 8,000 caseworkers in 3 boroughs of New York City walked out of their jobs on strike, not for their own contract, but for the rights of their clients. And that moment, that very dangerous moment for the state, is the moment that they started to use these tools. And so I think if we look at the history of where these tools come from, they give us a very different set of reasons why they exist, the kind of political problems they were actually meant to solve. And the political problems, the tools that I looked at in this book were meant to solve is the problem of the power of poor and working class people when they come to a place of solidarity. It's the problem of caseworkers looking across the desk and being like, we're actually on the same side. And that, I think, is the solution, right? Or is at least part of the solution. The state is, and bless public administration, it's an incredibly hard job, but this is not something they're going to do without us asking them hard. And so this is what I think that the issue is like, how do we find the solidarity and the analysis and the practices that we need to make that kind of demand?
Thank you. Do we have any questions in the audience? Does anyone... I per recordar, es poden fer en català, les podéis hacer en castellano, com estigueu més còmodes.
Hi Virginia, thank you so much for your time. I'm Paula. And I have a question about your book. In your book, you explain multiple cases in which people has an over-reliance on the outcome of the algorithmic systems. And I think the appearance of neutrality is not a discussable key factor on that. But you also explain a case where some workers had limited time to work on specific cases, so they had to over-rely on the algorithmic solutions because otherwise they didn't have time to provide the same work quality. And I was wondering whether you have found other common patterns that explain this over-reliance, apart of the neutrality, appearance of neutrality that cannot be discussed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Hang on. That is very disconcerting, hearing myself in 2 places. but I'll put it back so that I can understand questions in Catalan or Espanol. So I actually want to push back a little bit on that question, if you don't mind. So one of the things that was really interesting to me that I found when I was doing my reporting in Pittsburgh was the way that the workers, the frontline workers that I talked about earlier, actually refused to rely on the system. So when this Allegheny family screening tool first came into operation in these call centers, the frontline workers, the call screeners, were not buying it. They were like, in fact, one of their bosses told me directly that the system was gobbledygook, which is like a English idiom for like stupid BS, but a polite way of saying it. And the caseworkers there told me, you know, the system actually doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem to be identifying risk very effectively at all. And we're going to trust our clinical judgment over the judgment of this tool that does not make sense. So the issue then was I went and talked to their managers, and I said to their managers, like, okay, well, what happens if this digital tool gives this family a very high risk score and the human screener gives it a very low risk score? Then what do you do? When I had asked the designers of the system that question, they said, oh, we hope that's an opportunity to train the model because we actually believe that the caseworkers have important clinical judgment. But when I asked their managers, they said, oh, what's obviously happening there is that the workers got it wrong, and we can use that as an opportunity to train the workers because the computer is obviously right and they're obviously wrong. So even though the designers intended that system to be trained by the humans rather than the other way around, the managers were saying, no, that the computer should be training the human workers. So I think this idea that we need to automate parts of these processes because we simply don't have time to do those, we don't have enough information or we don't have enough time to make sound decisions. I actually think that argument hides a political choice for that accepts austerity, and that in a world where we're constantly trying to shrink public assistance budgets and workforce, then we feel like we don't have enough time. But that isn't natural or inevitable. We could have more generous and more humane public services. Again, I'm speaking for the US context. I suspect you might have some of those issues in Spain as well. So I actually think what you're speaking of as the over-reliance on the numeric score is a capitulation to austerity that I think is a political decision. And we can unmake that political decision. Yeah.
Hola, bona tarda. Bueno, jo vinc amb una experiència, diguéssim, laboral de 10 anys de l'àmbit social, treballo a serveis socials i, per tant, m'aproximo una mica en aquesta conversa com si el tema tecnològic fos el final de la canonada, diguéssim, de la política pública, no? I entenc el procés d'automatització tecnològic al final com una clau d'accés a uns determinats recursos públics que són escassos, no? I que en el nostre cas, en el cas de l'estat espanyol, estan realment molt poc desenvolupats. És a dir, hi ha molt poca aplicació tecnològica a l'hora de prendre decisions en els serveis socials. Des d'aquesta experiència, jo crec que, efectivament, aquelles vies que trobem en els algoritmes moltes vegades estan en les pròpies mirades dels educadors i dels treballadors socials d'aproximar-se en els casos i en les famílies, perquè quan traiem l'algoritme el que queda és que la clau d'accés a aquells recursos és el propi treballador i el propi professional i que també ha d'estar dient, projectant en el futur en quina mesura aquell recurs tindrà més impacte en una família que en una altra, no? I per tant, aquí hi ha una interrelació que sí que és veritat jo penso que s'ha de treballar de com entrenem l'algoritme, però també com l'algoritme pot entrenar al treballador o a la treballadora social, no? Això és la primera. Crec que ens falta molt de comprensió, de comprendre els processos d'exclusió a l'hora de poder projectar polítiques públiques. És a dir, tu posaves, per exemple, el cas de l'ingrés mínim vital, en un context d'estat d'alarma, de tancament, situar un inici d'un procés altament tecnificat i tecnològic és una barrera d'accés brutal a que totes les persones que haurien de ser potencials beneficiaris d'aquesta política puguin accedir-hi, no? I per tant aquí hi ha d'haver també una reivindicació de l'administració en anar a buscar proactivament en clau garantia de drets aquelles persones que són potencialment beneficiaris de recursos que no saben ni que poden disposar d'ells, no? Llavors, en aquest sentit, a mi m'agradaria algunes advertències, perquè aquí, per exemple, cada vegada que s'intenta fer un recull, un dataset sobre com són aquests beneficiaris, com hi ha una resistència per part dels treballadors i els educadors socials que no veuen com això pot contribuir a una millora de les seves intervencions, no? Llavors, jo crec que hem de fer també una mica hem d'explicar les avantatges que té poder conèixer com són aquests processos d'exclusió, no? I crec que aquí, per exemple, hi ha diversos estudis que expliquen com el procés d'escassetat fa prendre males decisions perquè la teva atenció està focalitzada en com aconsegueixes recursos ara i aquí per a sobreviure i, per tant, el benestar del teu nen o la cura o el donar-li experiències gratificants queden una mica en un segon lloc, no? I crec que hem de posar en accent, a mi m'ha agradat el llibre en aquest sentit, en com l'automatització tecnològica acaba amplificant aquesta desigualtat, però hi ha una automatització que al final està en el principi del procés, que és la desigualtat i la perpetuació de la desigualtat, que s'explica en com en les escoles reproduïm les habilitats d'uns fills amb uns altres, com no hi ha mobilitat social perquè aquestes habilitats es posen en joc i al final acaben tornar-nos a classificar d'allí on sortim, no? I la meva pregunta és aquesta, és a dir, com generem un procés que situï el tema de com pot contribuir la tecnologia en fer aquest procés des del principi i no situar-lo al final, no? És a dir, com posem la tecnologia per a que pugui generar una certa mobilitat social, no?
Thank you for that question. Also, thank you for being here. I think that one of the great joys of reporting the book was talking to caseworkers who had been around for a while and who often had very good analysis of the role that these tools played in not just their day-to-day work, but in the way that the field of social work they felt shifting. So Jane Porter Gresham, for example, who was a caseworker in Indiana who had been there for 30 years, said that her great concern was not that not the automated eligibility itself, but was the fact that caseworkers had begun to believe, or social workers had begun to believe, that their job was primarily information processing. And she said, but this is not the job, right? That the job is something else. And part of that is accompanying people through some of the most difficult parts of their lives, some of the most difficult moments in their lives. And she was deeply concerned about that. I also want to say one other thing about social workers, and then try to come to some kind of way at getting at your question about what role can technology or data play earlier in the process. And that's what I understand your question to be. Is that correct? Okay. So the other thing I wanted to say about social workers is that this is particularly true in the case in Los Angeles, where I worked in unhoused communities there for most of a year, reporting about the coordinated entry system. And there's 66,000 unhoused people in Los Angeles. That is my entire city plus 16,000 people. This is a enormous humanitarian crisis. That frontline homeless service workers are the ones that then need to bear the burden of making decisions about who gets access to the limited number of resources the county is willing to provide. This is entirely unfair and also inhumane. My fear that I describe in the book is the fear that because those decisions are so hard, because we don't want to face the real solutions, we then simply outsource those decisions to computers because it's too hard for us to do it. I talk about it in the book as a kind of empathy override. So I have extraordinary empathy for people who are in the position that you're in, of being the filter between the state and this enormous need that often the state has also created, right? So this is a horrible, difficult, incredible position to be in, and continuing in it for any amount of time, particularly 10 years, is heroic. So I just want to say thank you for that. I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer to your question, right? Like, how do we use these tools earlier in the process in ways that help support the human work of social work is something that I struggle with. I have not seen a lot of great examples of that out in the field, out in the reporting and the research that I've done. I think the designers of the Allegheny family screening tool, for example, would say directly that's what their tool does. I don't believe it's what their tool does. We have a profound disagreement about that. They would say it's just giving caseworkers better information at the time that they need it. It's supporting their decision making. It's not supplanting their decision making. But then when I went and sat in the offices, that's not what was happening in the actual work in the office. So I'm afraid I don't have a great answer to that. And I suspect that social workers might be the people who have the answer to that question. So that's maybe there's a role for organizing inside the profession there, of trying to figure out how to address these tools that not only often hurt your clients, but also de-skill social workers, and I really think demean the work. To say that is just data processing, I believe demeans the human work of social work. So I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I don't. But if you come up with some answers, I would love to hear them. So please share them when you have those conversations with your colleagues. Thanks.
Gracias. Yo quería, bueno, en realidad comentar varias cosas. En primer lugar, tú comenzaste hablando de cómo hace 30 años te diste cuenta que se hablaba mucho de la cuestión de la diferencia de acceso y que luego te diste cuenta que esta no era la verdadera cuestión, ¿no? Y yo pienso que hoy en día, 30 años después, se sigue hablando muchísimo sobre la brecha digital. La diferencia de acceso es para las compañías y también para la administración pública todavía una cuestión central, y me parece preocupante que 30 años después en el discurso público sigamos hablando tanto de eso y no entendiendo que esa no es la cuestión fundamental. Luego, otro punto, hablaste mucho sobre la organización de las personas afectadas por estas herramientas, y yo me pregunto cuánto... es muy difícil saber realmente cuánto estamos siendo afectadas por decisiones automatizadas, porque son cosas muy opacas. Entonces hay una gran dificultad para organizarnos si no sabemos realmente cuánto estamos formando parte de esto y siendo afectadas, ¿no? Aparte de la dificultad para después demandar, ¿no? O hacer algún ejercicio legal para decir ha sido violado este derecho, se me ha afectado de esta manera, ¿no? Y por último, una cuestión que sé que no es objeto de tu trabajo, pero no sé si está en tu pensamiento, ¿no? Cuánto el uso cada vez mayor de herramientas tecnológicas tiene un impacto ecológico brutal por el incremento del uso de recursos materiales de difícil acceso y el uso de energía, y quería saber si tenías alguna reflexión al respecto. Gracias. Y perdón por hacer 3 preguntas en una.
Gracias. Thank you so much. I will try to be very quick, and then we can talk some more later if you'd like us to go deeper. On the access question, I also really want to be understood that I believe that access is absolutely crucial. Like that, of course, this is a baseline issue. And I think, again, a perfect example of this is the ingreso mínimo vital, which is because of the pandemic, or maybe because the pandemic provided a opportunity, largely a digital process with almost no human interaction involved, which meant that everyone who lacks literacy, a computer, a decent internet connection, and a decent phone is pretty much locked out. And this is a fundamental problem. So I think access continues to be a fundamental problem, and we need to continue to address it. It's just not the only problem, but it is a fundamental one. To the second question of like how difficult it is to understand these systems, I think that there is some degree of what we would call in the US math washing that happens, where there's a lot of hand waving about how complicated these systems are and how you couldn't possibly understand them because you're just a limited mortal and don't have a computer science degree or whatever. And in some cases that's true. But from my own reporting, I can tell you the system in Los Angeles that was supposed to be these 2 very sophisticated algorithms, one that ranked unhoused people based on their vulnerability, and the other that matched them to available appropriate housing. That first one was a paper survey that just you added up numbers from 0 to 17, not very complicated. The second one was a guy sitting in a chair looking at a Google spreadsheet. Right? So there is some kind of like don't look behind the curtain thing happening when we really focus on the complications of the system. This is not to say that like actually like AI that does neural processing or vision, like image recognition is not actually complicated, or machine learning that teaches itself is not actually complicated. It is, and we need those skills too. But I don't think you need a computer science degree to know when you're getting screwed. And I think that people are perfectly capable of recognizing how these tools work in their daily lives. So they may not know what the specific kind of machine learning model is, exactly how it works. That's something that we can do with research and sharing with each other. But people will talk at great length about the way the system works. And when they say the system or they say the government, this often means these digital tools that are embedded in those systems as well. So I have found, at least in my reporting, that people are very smart about these tools. They have very good predictions about what kinds of problems they might have. And in fact, in at least 2 of the cases in this book, it was the people who are directly impacted by these systems who schooled me on how these systems were working rather than the other way around. So I just want to say we should not buy this idea that it's too complicated for normal people to understand, because that's what royal families and monarchies used to say to people who wanted democracy, right? It's not that complicated. It is sometimes complicated, but it's not that complicated. And finally, I just will say a very brief thing about the environmental impact, because I think that's so crucial, which is we may call it the cloud, but all of this happens on land, using water, using energy, and using resources that are taken from all over the world in really extractive and dangerous ways. And so it's absolutely crucial to pay attention to this. It's like, yeah, it's not something I do, but it's absolutely something I pay attention to, and I think is really crucial. So thanks for raising it.
So if we have no more questions, I'm going to do a very short infomercial, which is that I was talking about my organization, Open Society Foundation's The Spy, and we're actually about to organize, if everything goes well in January next year, a workshop exactly on the intersection between climate change and all this massive data treatment technologies, which is huge, which is estimated to very soon be as much as global aviation, for example, or global flying. So anyway, it's been a wonderful October evening, hasn't it, out here in Canòdrom, and I must thank the audience for really good and challenging questions, and also, Oyidiya's question on violence, for example, I think led us into interesting places, and also Lina's invitation to build this global social movement. Let me just end perhaps with the book, because I think Virginia spoke for herself very eloquently, and I'm not even going to try and summarize. But I think this book, when Barbara Ehrenreich wrote Nickel and Dimed, which was a book which is important about not getting by in America, she called it, about working poor women who worked very hard and yet were poor. She didn't invent the topic. When Katie O'Neill in 2016 wrote Weapons of Mass Destruction, and that was an important book in explaining how the obsession with this kind of, you call it path washing, right? It just, once you bring in the numbers, then social problems get solved. Not only this, actually she proved once you bring the numbers, actually some problems get much worse. When Zsuzsanna Zuboff wrote about the age of surveillance capitalism, or for the Spaniards, or Spanish people reading Spanish here, when Marta Peirano wrote El enemigo conoce el sistema, they didn't discover surveillance and all this. But like this book, like Virginia's book, those are books that weave together knowledge, research, empathy, narratives, stories, and that strike a chord at a certain point in society. And I think the moment also was ripe for your book. And this is an important book. I would say read it. If you don't read it in English, you have got it in Spanish, because it brings two huge issues of our time together. Yes, technology and its effects, but I think, and to me was one of the most compelling parts of the argument, the very persistent stories, prejudice, bias, and really almost deep cultural conceptions about poverty, about what being poor is and what it means, which when you confront them with the actual lived experiences, they are really troubling. So I'll end here, thanking Virginia above all, but everyone else for this great time together, which we can extend a little bit over a drink back there, and just advising everyone to if you haven't read the book, to have a look. So thank you everyone, and thank you Virginia, thank you Oyidiya, thank you Lina.